out. Everybody.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Lights Out. I'm your host, Josh. I'm joined in the studio by my co-host, Austin.
Hey, man.
Beside me today.
Yeah, we're cozy over here.
And our producer, Danny, who's back over there as usual. But you're probably wondering why we're sitting so close to each other.
It's because we like each other.
Well, we professed our love to each other last week, so we thought it was only fitting to sit side by side from here on out.
Sorry, Kendall.
Yeah. But no, what's really cool about today's episode is that we have a guest. Yes, we have our first guest in a long, long time here on Lights Out. And I think you're going to really enjoy today's episode, as we're going to have a very interesting deep dive conversation on the man that we spoke about last week, Ted Kaczynski. But what makes this conversation truly unique is we are going to be talking to somebody who actually lived next door to the man himself, the Unabomber. And for 16 years, she lived there with her family. And she's going to give us the inside look at what that was like and how that affected her family. And today we are very excited to announce that Jamie Gehring is here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We are so thrilled to have you on the show and dive into your book, Madman in the Woods, which, amazing, by the way. I think, your first book, right?
My first book, yes.
And there's so much more that I think people need to know about this story and about this case, and also about what your family went through. So we're going to get into all of that today, which I'm very excited about. And I just want to say, I'm sorry if my voice sounds a little raspy. I was a little sick this weekend, but I was like, I am not missing this interview for the world. So I'm going to try to keep my mouth shut today and let Jamie.
Thank God.
Yeah, finally, right? We're all like, it's about time. But let's just dive right into who is Jamie Gehring, and maybe give us a little background information and kind of take us back to where this all began for you.
Absolutely. So I, as you mentioned, grew up in Lincoln, Montana, and in a quaint little log cabin outside of town, about 4 miles, like the most picturesque childhood you can imagine, just surrounded by towering ponderosa pine trees, rambling streams, isolated mountain lakes, truly a beautiful childhood. And that definitely came abruptly to a stop when we realized at the age of 16 that our neighbor, Ted Kaczynski, was in fact the Unabomber. And of course, at the time, that was very pivotal for me and really changed the way I looked at the world. And I knew that it impacted me so much that one day I wanted to write a book about this experience. I wasn't sure what that would look like or what that would entail. But years later, when I was in a position in my life where I was a mother, my children were a little bit older, I had the time to truly spend on researching this beyond what I experienced. I wrote a book, and it ended up being what's called a braided memoir, which is my own experience, essentially braided with Ted's life. Not only Ted's life, the people that he affected around him, his own family members, what shaped him. Even I went as far as going to the FBI to get their take on this person outside of my own experience.
Yeah, well put. I can imagine how difficult it must have been to not only remember all the things that you went through, but then interweave those with all of this other information that you're getting from the number of names involved with this case is just mind-blowing. It was hard to even keep track of it in our episode last week to try to, figure out, your family. Let's talk about your family, and because I think sometimes it was a little confusing to understand, your father, who he was married to, in kind of your family dynamics. Will you kind of walk us through what your family looked like during that time?
Yeah, so I was born in 1980, and my mother and father lived together in, again, a home that they built in Lincoln, Montana. And I was around 3 when my parents separated. My mom moved to Helena, Montana, a close town. And my father, Butch Gehring, he did remarry, and he married a woman named Wendy, who is my stepmother. And him and Wendy lived there for many, many years and were together at the time of Ted's arrest.
And then you had a half-sister, correct?
Yes. So they did have 3 children, my sister Tessa and my little brother Robbie and sister Rianne. So I got to be a big sister finally.
What age were you when Ted purchased property from your father?
So Ted purchased property from my grandfather before I was born. And I come from a family of ranchers, generations of ranchers, cattle ranchers, who actually still work cattle and are current day ranch folks. And it was 1971 when my grandfather decided to sell off a portion of his 8,000-acre ranch. And at the time, it was, just a very small portion. It was 1.4 acres, and it was on the outskirts of his ranching operation. He didn't have much need for it. It was kind of a dark, very timbered piece of property. And at that time, Ted Kaczynski was living in Montana with his brother David. He had recently left his job as a professor at Berkeley and saw the listing and decided to purchase this property with the help of his brother, David Kaczynski. And really, our lives were forever changed with the signing of that deed over to David and Ted, because David was not aware of this, of course, but Ted's motives were clear to him even at that time in the 70s when he moved to that little isolated piece of property in Lincoln, Montana. I talk a lot in my book about how calculated, how methodical Ted Kaczynski was. This was just one more example of that, because where he chose to go, he knew that he would be able to carry out his acts of terrorism in a very secure way, because he knew he could blend in with the community, with the type of lifestyle there. And obviously that worked because he went undetected for 17 years.
I think that's such a mind-blowing thing to think of, especially in today's age where it's much harder, I feel like, to do that. Like the area that you grew up in, obviously it's rural, but you're not 100, 200 miles away from civilization. You still can drive into town a few miles. Ted can ride his bike into town. So it's interesting because if you look at Ted as a person, he really struggles on the social side of things, but yet he's able to kind of move to this new location, assimilate himself into the community somewhat. Obviously, he's a hermit, keeps to himself. But was there, like, everybody kind of knows each other, right? There's this, everybody knows everybody. Did your dad remember, like, what anybody said when he bought the property, or is there any, like, initial impressions of Ted that he ever shared?
So there was another neighbor that delivered the news to my own father that Ted had moved in to the property. And at that time, he hadn't even started building his cabin yet. He was essentially camping on the property as he spent time there and built the cabin. But the initial impressions of Ted when he first arrived to Lincoln were that he was a bit shy, a bit odd, but really nothing that was too alarming. And at that time, too, he did look much more like the Berkeley professor. He was
Right.
more clean cut. He was wearing, boots that didn't have massive holes in them and regular clothing. And so he was able to fit in as just a regular neighbor.
So your community was, would you say, welcoming to him? Because sometimes you hear of small towns and even places in Montana, and maybe it's just Hollywood with like the Yellowstone show, where it's like anybody that moves in, from California to Montana, they're like, we don't want you here. So I'm curious, was there any of that sentiment there? Like, with people like, oh, who's this who's this guy coming in?
I don't think so. And that's mostly because he was so reclusive. If he was from California and, trying to join the Chamber of Commerce and change
Right.
the laws
Yeah,
and, things like that, I think he definitely would have been received very differently. But, just to paint the picture a little bit more, this community is only about 1,000 people.
Wow, that's small.
It's very small. We have one grocery store, one gas station at the time, about 7 bars, but that's
Very important. One for each day.
7 bars, 7 churches, one grocery store. A flashing yellow light through town. I mean, you're not even stopping at a stoplight going through Highway 200 straight through the town of Lincoln. It's very small. It is very connected as a community. If somebody has a family there and one of their children is sick and they need some medical assistance, the community comes together, cuts firewood, has fundraisers. And so they really do support each other and welcome each other, but they also provide the space for people who need it. And so at the time that Ted moved there especially, there were quite a few Vietnam veterans that had moved to the area that, lived a little more reclusive lifestyle, but the community welcomed him and knew that they also needed their own space. And so that was just kind of the culture. And again, it was a choice Ted made that was very methodical.
Yeah, I mean, what better place to go than the middle of Montana?
Yeah, seriously. And you say he's very unsuspecting and he kind of fits in to some degree. But do you remember, I mean, hindsight's always 20/20, but do you remember, from what I remember from your book, it's Wendy was maybe the first one to notice there was something maybe a little bit more alarming, not necessarily like this is a domestic terrorist, but there's something a bit off, more so than the other people around town. Do you remember that at all? Or was Wendy the first one to really bring that up?
Yes, I think there were multiple people that thought that Ted was just a little bit off, a little bit different. But Wendy was the first, in my experience, to really find Ted to be abrasive, and their relationship did not get off to a good start. For one, Wendy is a very opinionated woman. She really doesn't take any shit from anyone. And she was pretty young at the time when she moved to Lincoln. She's in her mid-20s. And she came from the city. And so she's really enjoying this rural environment and being 4 miles out of town and not being able to even, see your neighbor because you're so surrounded by trees and nature. However, she started to feel in her own home watched, and she was being interrupted a lot by Ted coming over to ask what time it was, what day it was. She found it all very annoying and off-putting, and finally, she stood up to him one day when he came to the door. He knocks on the door just as usual and says, what time is it? What day is it? And Wendy said, it's time to buy a fucking watch. And she had it.
Yeah.
And so talking about that story now, it is terrifying that she said that to this man that we now know was maiming and killing right next door. But that was how their relationship started. And it really was how it continued through the years until Ted's arrest.
Wow.
I find it fascinating that it's always the women in these stories. With Ted, it's like the person who kind of outed him at the end of the day was Linda, who, to fill people in, Linda was David Kaczynski's wife. David Kaczynski is Ted's brother. And now I find it fascinating that Wendy, your stepmother, didn't take any shit from Ted. And it's like these strong, powerful, kind of smart, educated women. And Ted he did not have a good relationship with women, as we know. And I just find I find that fascinating that it's these women who are confronting him and kind of taking him down a peg.
Yeah, that is interesting. And it was a resounding theme in my life. And as a kid, I always kind of felt I had that empathy of children, and I felt bad for Ted when Wendy would tell him off when Ted came by, like, oh, he's just here to ask for the time. Gosh. But of course, as a woman and as an adult now and a mother, I absolutely understand where she was coming from.
Yeah, having a creepy guy just come over to constantly ask the time with your children around. Yeah, I get it.
What was your first interaction with Ted? What's your earliest memory?
So Ted did come to our house for dinner when my parents, my mom and my father, were still married. And, they played pinochle together. Ted held me as a baby. Of course, I don't remember those things. I had to rely on the memory of my mom and stories from my dad for that. However, my first real memory of Ted, I was pretty young. I was around 4. And my parents were separated, so I was going back and forth. And so that's really how I timeline my memories, as many kids from divorced families know. And so anyways, I was outside playing by myself, as I did a lot in that environment. And all of a sudden, as I'm playing outside with my cat, there is somebody on the mountainside with me. And as they approach, I realize it's Ted. And we called him Teddy, especially in those early years. And I was excited to see him. I do not remember being scared at the time. I was actually ecstatic because he had brought me a gift that day and he had hand painted some rocks for me. Of course, I played by myself a lot out there. I did have cousins, but they were about a mile away. And so I was just excited to see somebody. And it was my first real memory of him. And of course, looking back now, I remember his wild hair, his smell. He really did smell like he lived in the wilds, because he did. He didn't have running water. He didn't have electricity in his cabin. And so he looked and smelled like a hermit would, as you can imagine. But my father always instilled in me, to treat people with kindness and be accepting. And so it wasn't very alarming because he was that strange guy next door. And he was offering some kindness to me. Of course, as the years went on, those interactions changed. And maybe it was that I understood more of the world around me, or maybe it was because he had changed so much, or most likely it was a combination of those two things. But those interactions didn't feel the same. I felt something guttural. I felt something was off with him as I got older.
Do you think those early interactions were genuine from him? Like he actually wanted this genuine neighborly connection?
That's a tough question to answer, because there is part of me that knows that he was craving that interaction, because while I was writing my book, I was reading his journal entries. And when I say journal entries, it's literally just thousands of pieces of paper that Ted was writing his innermost thoughts, what he ate, what he hunted. Even he had his journal for his criminal activity that was separate. But in those journal entries, especially from the 80s, so this is about the time I'm really little, he is talking about how lonely he is and just like how much sorrow he has and how he longs for a partner, for a family. And so I do think that at that time, he was getting something from us, from that companionship, being around a family, holding a baby, having, the sharing in the intimacy of a meal shared and those things that he wasn't getting on his own and that he was missing. But I also at the same time think that part of it was his cover. Because if he was always in that cabin by himself, knowing my father especially, he would have come to check on him. He would have tried to invite himself in and make sure everything was okay. And so I think that there was a small percentage of participation that Ted knew that he had to give in order to be looked at as just that sort of normal neighbor.
Right, yeah. Not to draw suspicion to himself. That's so interesting to think about that Ted is, here's this guy who is a genius, on an IQ level, and it's such a multifaceted problem that he has. He's trying to follow these philosophical ideas that he's creating, and he thinks that's his purpose in life. But yet there's the human side of him that's just longing for that connection, that relationship that he's never had. Do you think that part of why he bought that parcel of land was because your family was there? Do you think he knew that you guys were there and what was going on? Or is that just a
No,
coincidence?
I think that was a coincidence because my father built the cabin with my mom after Ted and David had purchased that property. So there wasn't a log cabin with a sweet young family living there when he bought the property. I think that, he probably was frustrated to see us move in there, but then decided, again, because he is so calculated, what he had to do to maintain his isolation and be able to do what he needed to do. And also, to fulfill a very small need in him, which maybe he didn't even realize was part of the reason he was coming over.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So he would come over and help out your family with housework and come over for dinner. You have any memories around that or any that your dad has shared with you?
Yeah, so definitely in the early 80s to even really the beginning of the 90s, Ted was coming over, was helping my father with projects around the house. And again, that was not out of just like the goodness of his heart. It was because Ted also needed things. Ted didn't have a vehicle, and he may need lumber to be hauled because he's building his outshed building or, something like that. And so he knew that he needed certain things from my dad. And so they definitely had kind of a barter relationship. And it did continue, for years. But then as Ted did isolate more, he wasn't at our house as often. He wasn't helping with projects. He did, however, come work for my dad, though, at his sawmill for a day, basically.
Wow.
And so the thing is, knowing Ted's views, knowing how he felt about industry and the sawmill and the noise of the mill and everything, especially that we know now, it was shocking for me to put that together, that Ted did concede to go work for my dad to fund his bombing campaign.
Wow, when you put it like that, that's brutal.
Growing up, cereal was one of the best parts of being a kid. But as I got older, I had to watch out for sugar and empty carbs. I mean, I remember as a kid eating bowl after bowl of sugary cereal as I was watching cartoons in the morning. And before I know it, I could plow through almost half a box in one sitting. I just love cereal so much. But now at 31 years old, can't really do that anymore without feeling the effects of that. But thanks to Magic Spoon, they have been able to create a cereal that is reminiscent of all of those cereals I used to eat as a kid, but one that is so much healthier for you. Magic Spoon was nice enough to send me a variety pack, which gave me 4 flavors, including cocoa, fruity, frosted, and peanut butter. And this pack has 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, which I'm always trying to get in protein every day, and only 4 to 5 grams of net carbs. It's only 140 calories per serving. Not only that, it's high protein, has 0 grams of sugar, keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, and soy-free. I am absolutely in love with the chocolate or cocoa Magic Spoon grain-free cereal. I had a bowl of this morning. It was delicious. It was sweet enough that it reminded me of all those sugary cereals I used to eat as a kid, but I feel actually great after eating a whole bowl of this. Again, 13 grams of protein per serving. So it's not just a bunch of empty carbs. You're actually going to feel somewhat full after eating this, which I love. So right now you can go to magicspoon.com/lightsout to grab a variety pack and try it today. And be sure to use our promo code lightsout at checkout to save $5 off your order. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product that it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund you your money, no questions asked. You really got nothing to lose here. Remember, start your day off right with a delicious bowl of high-protein cereal at magicspoon.com/lightsout and use code lightsout to save $5 off. Thank you, Magic Spoon, for sponsoring this episode, and I'm going to go have another bowl now.
Did he know, or did you guys know at the time how he felt about industry? Like when he came to work at the sawmill, were you guys kind of aware of his very highly opinionated ideologies?
No, he kept all of that very secret. Ted was always just on the surface with conversation. Even if my folks asked him about where he went to school or where he's from, it was always a very brief answer, and then the subject would be changed. He was very careful about the information that he shared about himself or his beliefs. However, there were times through the years where Ted could no longer hide how he felt about certain topics. One being, there was an incident in which my father, again, we're in the 80s, 90s, and I have to say this because my father was a very responsible, respectful logger, sawyer, but he did use weed spray. He didn't know the dangers of weed spray at that time. And Ted obviously had done more research on it and had a very strong opinion not to use such things. And so they got into a massive altercation about that. And it was one of those times in which Ted could no longer hide his anger. And it was, my dad was a Green Beret. He was a very self-sufficient man's man out there with his sawmill and being from ranchers. But it scared him, that interaction with Ted, just because of the look in his eyes, the way his body was shaking, his face was red. He could just see that rage and that anger that he didn't experience before. And so there were definitely times in which Ted could no longer hide his own opinions, but it wasn't a regular occurrence.
Did your dad know that he had weapons?
My dad did know that he had weapons, that he had at least a rifle because they had talked about hunting.
Right.
Would he hunt on your property?
So that was a definitely a discussion that my father had with Ted. My dad did hunt. He would get his tags to go elk hunting, but he didn't like hunting on his own property because he was such a softie and he fed his deer and he fed his elk. And so they were, like pets, I guess, in a way to him. So he liked to hike out a bit to do his hunting. And he was worried that Ted was poaching and not getting his tags and poaching on his property. And so there were some conversations, especially early on, about one, getting your tags to be legal, and two, I'll show you the places to hunt, but it's not right here in my backyard.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even think about that. To hunt legally, he would have had to go get licenses and tags for that and register. And so he probably was poaching then.
Yes. And
illegally
he was
hunting.
Yeah, I mean, he's writing in his journals about killing porcupine and grouse, but also coyotes. And I mean, it was definitely illegal what he was doing.
So that would be the way he'd stay self-sufficient, self-sustaining, is hunting. And so he really tried to live that primitive lifestyle, the hunter-gatherer, off-grid, no electricity, no plumbing. Where'd he get his water from?
So there was a little rambling creek behind his cabin.
Did he have water rights to that?
That's a good question. You'd have to
Not
ask
that matters.
my grandfather.
I guess if he's poaching,
Yeah,
he
if he's
probably
poaching,
doesn't
he
care
doesn't
about
care.
water
He's probably
rights.
not too worried about
He's
it.
bathing in there.
Yeah.
I mean,
drinking.
that's what I always imagined when I was a kid, is that's where he took his baths. He didn't
Yeah.
have running water, and he definitely smelled as though he didn't.
Where was his bathroom? Did he build himself a little outhouse? I think we were kind of debating about this.
Yeah.
We were like,
Did he have a bucket?
He had, a bucket.
Just a bucket in
A
Yeah.
bucket on a pulley system.
oh God.
Yes.
So
And you were saying, we were kind of talking about, we were going through this photo album that you have, and you pointed out the jacket, and he would occasionally have to go into town. And yeah, I wonder that this guy who's so grimy, doesn't have running water, you would say he would kind of present himself when he would go into town. Obviously you would stick out kind of like a sore thumb, or would you? If you went into town and you kind of looked like he did and smelled like he did, would people kind of accept that?
So it depends on what
Okay.
town you're talking about. So in Lincoln, most of the residents knew of him, right? They knew Ted was the hermit and lived off the land. And so when he looked rugged, it was very much accepted. Now, he would get on a bus, on a Greyhound bus, and travel to deliver his bombs. And so he had to definitely change the way that he looked in order to do that. He would shave, he would wear a blazer. He definitely, and then when he came back, it was, again, very calculated. He would stay in his cabin until the hair on his face grew back and he looked more like himself. We never once saw him with a clean-shaven face.
wow.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. He was so calculated, he probably thought about all that before ever going to town. If you're going to walk into the post office and you look the way you do, you smell the way you do, people are going to remember you, right? So it kind of makes sense that Ted would think ahead. And even though it was against his kind of natural self, so to speak, he would clean himself up.
Yeah,
just
he
so
had to
people
blend
wouldn't
in.
remember him. Yeah.
So I know this is kind of a sore subject, and obviously nobody likes to hear about animals being hurt or killed. But do you remember the time around when your dogs were killed and poisoned?
So our family had one dog that was poisoned, and it was in the 90s that our dog started to get really sick. It was a long, painful death, unfortunately. And originally the vets were trying to figure it out, do all sorts of blood work, and they were like, he must have gotten into something. And he did end up passing away, and they were able to say that it was strychnine. And so as horrible as that was, at the time, there was nobody in my family that would have said, oh, that was Ted Kaczynski. That was, of course, our neighbor. But when I was writing my book, I was, documenting all of our different interactions and putting myself back in these scenes from childhood. And I remembered so specifically every time Ted would walk by our sawmill or the house or ride his bike by our dog Wiley, who was this sweet family pet. He was kind of a mutt, but he definitely had black lab in him. He was just the sweetest dog. When Ted was around, his hackles would rise. He would growl. He would chase him. It was really intimidating for Ted. And so this happened through the years. Then when our dog had passed away, we discovered that our neighbor was the Unabomber. When I was doing my research, found a letter from Ted Kaczynski that he had written after being apprehended. And in it, he admits to poisoning a dog that was sneaking into his garden at night. Then beyond that, when I was looking through the FBI evidence, there were strychnine oat pellets found in his cabin. So I think it was retaliation in his mind, because he was getting rid of this dog that had become a nuisance to him, sneaking into his garden, but also was probably directed at us as well, because we lived so close, because we were in each other's backyards, essentially. He couldn't draw attention by harming us, but he could kill our dog.
Was this after the weed spray incident?
Well, Wiley did pass after the weed spray incident,
Okay.
yeah.
Find it interesting just as another hypocrisy of Ted, because, he's screaming and having this altercation about the weed spray, yet he's willing to then go poison a dog. It almost seems like you're trying to protect nature and be natural about it, but then just doesn't make sense for him to do that. But that's just one of many, I guess.
Yeah, and there was another neighbor that lived about another mile from us that had incidents through the years of his dogs being poisoned, one being stabbed. And so he definitely, after Ted's arrest, blamed Ted as well.
How far was your house and Ted's cabin? Like, I think that's hard to read about, from your experience, how quickly could you get to Ted's cabin if you wanted to?
As someone who grew up in the suburbs, I'm like, my neighbor was right there. So it is kind of hard to visualize it.
So we were a quarter mile away.
Okay.
And kind of the layout of it is you leave the town of Lincoln, Montana, the flashing stoplight, you drive around 4 miles, and then you turn off of this main road, which was called Stemple Road. And then there was a long, winding driveway, and you could take a turn off and go to Ted's house, or you could keep going and arrive at our house. And so there were a couple other neighbors out there as well, but pretty spread out. And so, Ted didn't have to interact with many people as the years went on even.
Where was your guys' mailboxes at?
Our mailboxes were out on the road.
Okay.
On the main road. My father, though, especially while he was running his sawmill, had a P.O. box. So we had to go to the post office to go check our mail.
Wow. Okay.
But Kaczynski's, I mean, it's a pretty famous photograph that's out there, but Ted Kaczynski's mailbox was just right there on the main road with his name on it, which is always eerie to see.
Yeah. God, that's wild. So there wasn't any fences or anything between your property and his?
No, I don't think really any of our, maybe there was one neighbor that did have a fence that was pretty close to my father's sawmill, but they weren't very common out there unless you were trying to fence in your livestock, if you had cattle or your goats or something like that. But otherwise, there's such massive parcels of property that there weren't a lot of fences. And the way that Ted would get to our house, the most direct way, was not on the main road, not on the driveway. There were a couple hills between our house and Ted's cabin, and there was a large rock quarry kind of in the middle of that as well. And there were these old logging roads. And so you could take the old logging road, and then you might have to climb a hill for a bit, go slide down the rock quarry, and then basically you were at Ted's.
Okay. That for some reason in my mind, I'm like, he could get binoculars and like see you, watch you from his cabin or something.
Too mountainous, and there's so many pine trees out there. I mean, it's one reason that the FBI couldn't get a clear shot of Ted's cabin is because it was surrounded by such dense forest that you couldn't see from place to place. But Ted was definitely outside of our home many times.
Yeah, what was that like? That's so creepy to think about.
It really is. And again, now being a woman and a mother, knowing how Wendy felt, having him creeping around, basically looking through the windows, seeing if we were home. There's a movie that was made called Ted K, and there's a scene in it in which Ted is in our driveway, and it's at night, and I believe in the scene, he's got his rifle. And my parents are in what was the greenhouse of our cabin, which is just full-length windows, and Ted is standing there watching. And it was filmed in my childhood home, and watching that still is so terrifying to me, because who knows how many times Ted was out there. He would gather pieces of metal from my dad's old equipment. My dad had an older boat out there. You know what rural Montana looks like, or rural areas where like people do not get rid of things.
No.
They have their old combine out there. They're like, who knows when I'm going to need to use this again. So my dad had an old boat, an old like Oldsmobile out there, a couple other things. And so Ted would sift through that machinery to find pieces of metal that would go untraced, because he could bring them back to his cabin, melt them over his little potbelly stove into fragments, and then put them in his bombs as shrapnel. So he was there for a purpose, but who knows what else he was doing out there.
Yeah.
Did your father or anybody in your family ever feel guilty over that? I know it's an unfair sense of guilt, but knowing that he used that for shrapnel, or knowing that maybe you helped him build certain things or just fund him when he worked at the sawmill, as you mentioned earlier, did your dad have a sense of guilt or anything?
Absolutely.
Oh, really?
And, it was difficult because, one, it's the culture, the community, that Western acceptance of, you might not be a traditional person, but we're still going to embrace you and accept you in our community. So you have that. And then you also have my own dad, who was he just had the biggest heart. He would literally give you the shirt off of his back. He was so kind. He was so trusting. He believed in the good of people until he didn't anymore. And so with Ted in those early years, he had no reason to suspect that he was this evil person. And looking back, of course, there were things that were alarming and he would have done differently. And I think that's probably why he felt such a need to help so much with the investigation and put himself at risk, because he did have guilt about missing signs or maybe what he would have done differently.
Yeah, I can only imagine what that must have been like. And also, do you remember when or maybe you were too young when the bombing started happening, but did your dad ever have the TV on and the news reports were playing? Do you remember that time at all?
Yes, I do. And, it was late 70s to 95 was Ted's last attack before his arrest. And so he was always so prominent in the news. He wasn't on newspapers, but the Unabomber was on newspapers and in the news and held the nation captive for so long. But my dad, I do remember him talking about it and just feeling so removed from it. Like, oh my gosh, this is such a horrible thing. But it's happening across the country. Like, we're in this little isolated pocket. And thank goodness we are, but obviously looking back, we were right next to it.
Yeah, 'cause it's so abstract when you see it on TV and it's a faceless man. You don't really think twice that it's your neighbor. Just to backtrack a little bit, in regards to the distance between your house and his, obviously, it's rural Montana. We knew that he hunted, he had rifles, so gunshots were probably fairly familiar. But was it ever confirmed he was detonating bombs, test driving bombs on his property, right? And I know he was trying to shield those noises with a miners doing dynamite and stuff like that. But were there ever any noises on your property where maybe you or your family members or somebody maybe second guessed those noises or something like that?
Yeah, there were some through the years. I was working with my dad in the lumber mill one day, and I heard a noise that I just couldn't quite discern, couldn't recognize, but it was loud. It didn't quite sound like gunshot. And so I told my dad, just stop, just, try to listen. And so we're sitting there trying, and it didn't happen again. But it was something that I, of course, won't forget now, knowing the context of it, knowing who my neighbor was. He wasn't testing those bombs on his parcel. He was hiking out in more remote places and using the shield of the space and the trees around him to try to muffle those noises. But a lot of that evidence was found by the FBI after his arrest, just walking the property with my dad and another neighbor out there. They found quite a few different areas where they were kind of like bunkers that Ted would test his bombs at.
God, that's crazy. Oh, man. And to think somebody could have stumbled upon him at any point in time. And
could you imagine that?
Yeah.
Like the way his disheveled hair and just
It's
someone
so
blowing.
scary.
It's so terrifying.
It is really scary. And there was a time when I was a teenager that I was on a walk and I was behind the house by the rock quarry, kind of going towards his house, but I didn't plan on going to his place that day. I was just hiking along the logging roads, and him and I came around a corner at the same time and just almost collided. And it was very close to the time that he was arrested. So he was full Unabomber at that time, no longer that Berkeley professor you see in the late 70s, 80s. He's gaunt, his eyes are wide, his cheeks are, hollow, his hair is everywhere. He looks frenzied. And at that time, I was terrified. And it was, of course, a combination of my age. I'm a teenager. I'm alone in the woods with a man. Like, all of that was scary, but then it was just him as well. And we both turn around and I start in a walk at first because I know he can see me walking back to the cabin. And then to my cabin, I just start, as soon as I know that he can't see me anymore, I'm running as fast as I can. I'm leaping over fallen logs and just running to get back to my house. And it was shortly after that he was arrested. But I think about that, like, what if I would have met him in a deeper area of the property? What if I came across him testing a bomb?
Right, yeah.
It could have been a completely different scenario. And so while that experience was startling, just thinking about all the different possibilities is truly terrifying.
Did you ever think about like spying on him and like seeing what he was up to, or maybe going and checking out his house or anything?
No.
Making the excuse, I was just, what day is it? What's the time of day? Doing the same thing to him.
What's the time?
Yeah.
I had a little Honda 90 motorcycle.
I was just going to ask you
when
about
I
that,
was a kid. And I also rode horses a lot. But on my little Honda 90, which was awesome, by the way, it's bright yellow. It was pretty sick. I was able to cover so much ground back there and all over our property. And I would take a lot of the old logging roads because they weren't in any way like suitable for a vehicle, but you could drive your motorcycle on them. And I wasn't just like driving through fields, And so there was a couple that went close to Ted's cabin, and I'm sure that made him very angry.
Mm-hmm. He didn't like people riding motorcycles.
Yeah. He's like, I don't like the noise of the motorcycle engines, but I can go blow up stuff and shoot my gun as much as I want, right?
Did you ever see Ted smile or laugh?
Oh, that's a good question.
Did he have an ounce of joy in him?
No. I mean, I can't say that I ever saw him. He gave like the closest thing to a smile when he gave me my rocks when I was little. And, he was at that time too, when you're speaking to children and you're a grown up, like you get down on the ground and there's like a kind of a
slight voice change.
Yeah. And so he did exhibit that, but there was never a time where I remember him like laughing at my dad's jokes or even really smiling. So no.
Because I'm trying to like picture what this family dinner must have been like. And your dad sounds like an awesome person who likes to have a good time, laid back, very wholesome. And then you've got like the polar opposite sitting at the table with you. And I'm just like, what? Was it just awkward the entire time? Or is there any, like, the dad's cracking jokes? Ted's just like, like,
my dad
what they talk
is super
about?
jovial. Like, he was just full of character, full of personality, loved to tell stories, very animated. And so he could fill the space, like it. There were multiple times where we would be driving back from like the grocery store and we'd see Ted walking and we'd pull over and pick him up. And Ted was always so awkward. And, it was very clear he did not want to have a conversation. He was accepting the ride because maybe it was raining or he was tired. But there was no like sense of community in that vehicle. Still, my dad would like chat the whole time.
Just like talking to a wall, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you would imagine it would be like horrifically awkward, but my dad somehow made it not be.
I know people like that. Those are good people. Because sometimes, I don't know, sometimes I don't always want to talk. So sometimes it's nice just to sit back and let someone else take
Yeah,
control.
I agree. I'm like that too. But if I were Ted and never able to talk to anybody, I think I would take that opportunity to at least like have some semblance of a conversation.
True.
You know what's better than coffee? Coffee with a cause. Criminal Coffee is created by YouTuber Stephanie Harlow, friend of the show, and police detective Derek Levasseur, also a friend of the show. Stephanie and Derek also host podcast Crime Weekly, and after covering so many cases and learning that in some instances, the cases aren't fully investigated due to lack of funding, they decided to do something about it, and that's where Criminal Coffee comes in. So why should you buy Criminal Coffee? Well, there's a lot of reasons why you should buy Criminal Coffee. For one, when you buy coffee from the store, it may have been a month or two before that coffee ended up on the shelf, but at Criminal Coffee, once the beans arrive, they're roasted, nitrogen sealed, and then they're shipped right to your doorstep, ensuring the best tasting, freshest coffee possible, which I can attest to their coffee. It is very fresh, very flavorful, and the smell is so potent. I can just smell it coming out of these sealed bags right now. It smells absolutely delicious. They offer light roast, medium roast, dark roast, and decaf, and ground whole bean and K-cups even. However you brew your coffee, they have got you covered. And if you enjoy true crime, you're going to love the design of their bags and boxes, which feature characters from the Criminal Coffee universe. All you have to do is scan the QR code right there on the back of the bag, and then you can dive into the character's story and all of the crimes that they're solving and which ones are committing them even. It's a whole universe to explore. But the most important thing, and the thing that I truly love about Criminal Coffee, is their dedication to solving cold cases, utilizing the latest technology in DNA testing, because a portion of the profits of every bag or box sold goes directly to this cause. They've raised over $15,000 and were able to save the first case they funded, which was a Jane Doe case that actually had an interesting twist. For over 50 years, investigators thought the victim was a woman, but once Criminal Coffee got involved and funded the DNA testing, it turned out the victim was actually a man. And not only were they able to figure out who the victim was, they also found his living relatives who now have answers about their loved one that they've been seeking for all these years. So if you want delicious high-end coffee delivered right to your door, head over to www.criminalcoffeeco.com and use my code LIGHTSOUT10 for 10% off your order. Once again, that's www.criminalcoffeeco.com and use code LIGHTSOUT10 for 10% off. Let's drink some coffee and solve some crime. So there was a point in which Ted, which by the way, I'm so sorry for my voice. I'm like losing my voice right now. So I'm doing the best I can, but there was an incident where now it's like cracking. I'm starting to sound like Ted. I feel like he has a very peculiar voice, by the way.
He does.
Creepy. I'm like listening to the tapes of him. But there was a point in which he aimed a rifle at Wendy and your sister. And what was going on there? Like that's a very weird incident that could have took a turn for the worst.
So this was, again, very close to Ted's arrest, this time frame. And at the time, he was completely immersed day to day in his reign of domestic terror.
Yeah.
All he was doing in that cabin was writing about his ideologies, who he wanted to target next, obviously testing bombs. That's what he was breathing. That was his life. And so, as you can imagine, as the years progressed and he's more and more immersed in this is all he's doing, all he's thinking, his behavior also started to visibly change, even, to us as his neighbors. That being said, there was one day in which he was out on his surrounding property. My stepmother, Wendy, was seeding our property out there because there had been some logging done with draft horses, and they had pulled these massive trees out through the property, and the grass had died. So she was out there reseeding, taking care of the property, and Ted saw her and my little sister, who was around 2 at the time. And she didn't know he was there. She could sense that there was something. She felt there was something ominous. She felt as though she was being watched. She's in the forest in Montana, so she's thinking mountain lion or some sort of predator. She ends up scooping up my little sister, getting her in the truck, and driving away. She didn't really think much more of it because, again, this is the lifestyle they live, right? Until after Ted's arrest, in the journals, Ted had spoken of that day. And he had written in his journals that he was looking through his scope on his rifle and going back and forth between my stepmother and my little sister, who was a toddler, my stepmother, my little sister, watching them in the scope and contemplating killing them. And the way he wrote it, something like, I could take the big bitch out, but then the little bitch would be left on the hill. And trying to kind of decide how he could kill them. And then decides finally that it's too close to home. But he also, in that moment, realized he could kill face to face if he wanted to. It was no longer this kind of faceless sending a bomb in the mail, which could be perceived as different, I suppose.
Yeah.
He could, in his mind, he knew that he could look at somebody and murder them.
It's almost crazier because you're almost in danger because you're so close to this guy, but at the same time, you're almost safer because he's too calculated to do something like that. And it just in a very strange way, it's almost like being right next to Ted Kaczynski almost saved you in a sense. That might be the wrong word for it, but because he was so calculated, even though he knew he was capable of doing these things, he's like, no, the police will track me if I do something like this.
Sometimes I think that, and then other times I am faced with different, like, for instance, here he is with all he has on the line in with his motives, with the crimes he's committing during his 17 years of domestic terror, being this serial bomber, the serial killer. He's still vandalizing a cabin nearby.
Right.
He's using an axe to cut down the door and destroying their snowmobiles. And with everything that he has, again, on the line for his own ideals, like his motives, what he's trying to do, he's willing to let his anger win and retaliate against this family that had been driving snowmobiles too close to his cabin. And then there were so many instances where I would find a letter that he had written in complaint, like to the telephone company or to local legislation with his own name on it, making complaints. And there's just that part of me that realized some of this was such a game to him. It was almost like he was trying to get away with as much. He was trying to win, essentially, with law enforcement. And he was willing to risk a lot in order to win these little cat and mouse games, as he saw. And then after Ted's arrest, there were wires that were found that were strung between trees, like around corners, that he put up in case there was somebody riding a motorcycle around his property. It would essentially decapitate them if they were going fast enough. And so, yes, there is that, I guess, sense of relief because we were so close, but then there's also just the unknown of what could have gone differently because he was willing to take those risks.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's like there's safety, but there's also chance of imminent danger.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What if he started like digging holes for some of these devices out in the woods and leaving them out there? And
Right.
there would have been no way to trace it back to him.
Yeah. And clearly he was willing to go after the dog. So, yeah.
So you really think there was a point that, Ted, this became about killing and not just furthering his ideologies and his message then?
So his response to maiming and not murdering people, and then his celebration of when people did die by his hands, didn't feel as though he was celebrating his ideology. He was celebrating his murders.
Mm.
And I think that speaks for itself.
You quoted Susan Moser, I believe is her name, who was the widow of Thomas Moser, who died. And I just want to pull this little quote because you brought this up in the book. I think you had a longer excerpt, but she said, "Make this sentence as permanent for him as he has made ours, Tom's and the others. His so-called causes are a smokescreen for his only objective, to kill anything that is alive." So do you abide by that theory that it's just a smokescreen at the end of the day?
I do feel that way. I think that he definitely had ideologies that he wanted to share. I do think that there were, and even in reading what he wrote, there's moments of clarity, there's moments of brilliance. He's a genius. However, it was as though the motive was really blurred in his mind. He was so filled with anger. He had this sense of he needed to seek revenge. And who knows what that really was born from. Was it born from his experiences in childhood or at Harvard, or, just the society in and of itself? We'll never really know. But he was a rage-filled killer. And all of the members of the FBI who crawled into his brain in his writings for years, that's the first thing they say.
Rage.
And it was almost just, like you said, a smokescreen for his killing.
Yeah, I believe that 100%.
Same.
I think, which is why, thank God he was caught when he did, because and also looking at his list of potential victims. He had his hit list was massive. And so at what point does it just become about annihilating your hit list versus spreading the message of your manifesto? And I think he did a poor attempt at trying to mask the manifesto to cover up the killing, because I think it's very apparent that this was about revenge. And there's that quote speaking to personal revenge for him that I think is true throughout this entire life. But I want to ask you, let's talk a little bit about, where Ted started in life and where he ended up is drastically different. And you're good friends with David, his brother, who, by all accounts is an amazing guy, totally normal. And so how did we get from point A to point B with Ted? What do you think happened there?
Yeah, for Ted, I think it was just that perfect storm. And he did have an incident when he was around 9 months old that he was separated from his mother. And at that time, it was a very critical time in his development at that age, realizing that he's not connected to mom anymore. And so that definitely could have had an effect on the rest of his development, the rest of his life. He was advanced multiple times in school, was never able to really connect socially to his peers. He always felt like an outsider and different. And then he goes to Harvard and he's only 16. I can't imagine being in that situation at such a young age. He wasn't socially ready. He may have been academically ready for that jump, but he was not socially ready. And then, of course, the experiments that happened there.
Yeah, what do you make of those?
I think that, they wouldn't take place now. Well, we would hope, right? I don't know, because I can't say that for certain. But ethically, I would hope that they would not take place, because here is this minor, and he's from a working class family in Harvard. He's worked really hard academically to get there. He's financially supported to get there. And here he is being really attacked for his ideals through these experiments, looking at the human's response to stress. And to Ted, not only is he feeling isolated, he's feeling different, he's feeling awkward, he's younger, he's from a different class of family than most at this school. He prides himself on his intellect. That's who he is. That is his self-esteem. That is his worth. That is how he was raised. And for better or worse, that is how he feels. And so for that to be attacked, for his ideas, to be attacked for his physical appearance, to be made fun of in these interviews was incredibly cruel and may not have had such an effect on another person, but for him, it was very detrimental. So he goes through this, all these little steps along the way. One by itself probably wouldn't have made a big difference in the trajectory of this person's life. But all along the way, these things are happening. And then after Berkeley, he goes to Montana, where he is just trapped in the echo chamber of his own mind constantly. And so that type of isolation can't be good for anyone, really. But to have these experiences, maybe have already an issue with mental health, then you add in the isolation. I mean, it was truly just, I hate to say perfect, but perfect storm for this individual to turn out the way that he did.
It's a perfect summary of Ted's journey there. I really appreciated that.
Like I said, there's no better way to put it. It's just, I wonder what his parents, I'm trying to remember, his parents know about the Harvard experiments?
So they actually had to sign
they did. Okay.
Yeah, they had to sign off on it. They, of course, didn't know the extent of what was going to happen. I mean, it was truly the way it was put was kind of these personality tests, and they would be writing about their personalities, their ideals, things like that. I don't think that his parents would have willingly signed him into something in which these people that he idolizes, the professors, are attacking the way that his beard looks or his ideas.
We're going to try to break you.
Yeah, right.
What is David's take? Does he kind of take the same stance that this was kind of a perfect storm of things, or what's his angle?
Yeah, I mean, he shared a childhood with his brother, and he'll be the first to say that there are things that happened in Ted's mind, they're completely different. And I think that's very similar to many siblings. One has one perspective and one has a completely different one. But with them, a lot of times the difference was very extreme in the way that they remembered their upbringing or their family. David always remembered his parents as being very loving, very supportive, and having an incredible childhood. Being in nature a lot and going camping and playing instruments together and being supported academically. While Ted definitely had a very different take on it. And so their perspectives are much different on childhood. And I think that David definitely shares in the idea that there were so many different things that Ted did go through. And I think that one of the things especially that David and his mother, Wanda, both felt was instrumental in Ted's change was that time as a baby being separated from his mother and being placed on splints so that he couldn't scratch his rash. And even she wrote in his baby book about the experience and how when she picked him up after he'd been in the hospital, he had just this institutional look, like he had just like given up. I mean, that's tragic. That's really sad.
Yeah, as a mother, I'm sure you can attest how important it is to bond with your child. And I know as a new parent, I can't imagine not having that bond, and especially hearing how they used to do things back in the day, like they'd whisk your baby off.
Right.
And now it's like they pull the baby out, put it right on mama's chest, and I couldn't imagine any other way. Like it just seems like that's what needs to happen. That bonding starts immediately versus separation. I can only imagine has some sort of psychological effect.
Absolutely, because at that time you think you are connected to your mother.
Well, you're physically connected.
You're physically connected, and then
you're severed, and then
mentally you are in your mind part of this other person. And so them not being there and being alone like that. And yes, it was horrible, but it was also, it wasn't that he was tortured. That was the times.
Mm-hmm.
That's how things were done. And again, that by itself maybe wouldn't have had an effect, but then all of the other things that happened after that.
Because I think a lot of people say, well, tons of people go through really horrible things or have horrible abusive childhoods, and they don't end up serial killers or they become great people. So why should we give Ted any sympathy for his upbringing? He's just an evil guy through and through, and that's it, right? Like, and as easy it is to just kind of sum it up as that, I think you do have to break it down and look at different things, because anything could be added or removed to change the course of somebody's life. I don't think you can just say there's one path to this, right?
I think it's as important as people too, just to be aware of there could be something that you do that changes the trajectory of someone's life.
It's like the butterfly effect.
Yeah, maybe there is somebody who has gone through something horrific in childhood, but you're able to help and inspire and do something great for this person. And maybe it changes, maybe it doesn't, but we all have, I guess, the power to affect others.
Yeah, and your family had such, whether you guys knew it or not, had an effect on Ted, and positive or negative depending on which way you look at it. But I think the biggest thing that stands out is the isolation, right? We all know there's studies that have been done on prisoners in solitary confinement. We know that it's not healthy for the human mind to be isolated from human contact. And so that to me is the biggest standout experience he had, where when you're trapped in your mind and you're thinking, you're especially that level of intelligence, and you're going so deep into the world trying to deconstruct it and figure out like, why is society the way that it is? It's almost like he was in this thought loop every single day. He's like, oh, we're doomed basically if we don't change the way that we live our lives. And I'm here to try to bring a solution to the table. And so he's getting trapped in this thought loop over and over again, while also there's that other part of him. There's that, the monster inside that is, seeking revenge. And I think the two kind of marry each other, and it manifests into what we see as the Unabomber, which I think really is the main reason why everybody's so intrigued by this case. Is here we have a genius level individual, mathematician, professor. I mean, this guy could have went on and done amazing things in his life. He could have been, searching the cosmos, or I mean, I know he solved an unsolvable equation. Like, he's that brilliant. And the fact that he made it to this point is just like, wow, what could have Ted done had he stayed on the right track, or had that person in his life that gave him what he was looking for, love, connection, or even just friendship, genuine friendship that feels like, because he did have the one friend that he bonded with in school.
Yeah.
But then, they separated and things just got worse and worse after that. So I think this is like in hindsight, and there's a moral of the story, I guess. It's just like how important relationships are in human interaction and love. Like, it's kind of like a story of like, this is what happens when people aren't loved, is, all sorts of things can go wrong. What do you think about all that?
Oh my gosh, I agree wholeheartedly. And it was one of the themes that I just kept coming back to in my book, is that theme of human connection. How would Ted's life have looked if he was emotionally capable of forming those relationships? Would he have turned out the way that he did? Possibly. But also human connection in the way that, looking at my own dad and his connection with FBI agent Max Knoll, who was the arresting officer on the Unabomber case, and how their friendship and connection really did contribute massively to the apprehension of Ted Kaczynski. And so when you start to peel it back, there's all of these examples of just how important these connections are, and such a strong theme, I suppose, in my book.
Yeah, I did want to come back around to Butch. I also want to touch on, we're on kind of the idea of fatherhood, and apparently what we touched on a little bit before this was, it sounds like Ted's father had a similar demise as Ted in prison, and you kind of enlightened me to that, and we didn't talk about that on our big episode. But could you touch on that, what you know about Ted's father, and obviously mental health, which is kind of the backdrop of that?
Yeah. So Ted's father, Ted Sr., lovingly referred to as Turk, was he was definitely a family man as far as David is concerned. They were always going on adventures together, hiking, camping. They were a very close family. And when Ted had been living in Montana, David and Ted were both adults. Turk discovered that he had terminal cancer. And instead of facing treatment and going the traditional route, he actually committed suicide. He committed suicide with a gun in their family home. And it was just it's so tragic anyway, but such a horrific event to have happened, and to find your husband and, father of your children deceased in your home like that. And so there was that question too, when I discovered that, of, was there some undiagnosed mental health issues going on in that home beyond Ted Kaczynski?
Yeah, because we know it's a bit debated, but he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And he also, if I'm not wrong, Ted also was diagnosed with cancer and also took his life. So strange how those things add up. Sorry if that got a little depressing there, but I did want to circle back to your father, though, because I think he's kind of a hero in this story. I find it fascinating that he kind of felt this responsibility after everything that happened. And you do have the video footage still that he took for the FBI. Could you talk about his mission, basically, when they requested that of him, and just get into that a little bit?
Yeah, so it was a very delicate dance with the FBI coming to my father, because this was an incredibly high-profile case that they had been working on for 17 years.
Yeah, wow.
And so they were very deliberate, very careful about who they spoke to, who knew about it, because obviously they didn't want anything tipped off. And so they did come to my father and danced around the subject a bit about, we're looking into your neighbor. He's suspected of writing some threatening letters. We're just kind of checking things out. And then as the conversation progressed and Max Knoll kind of felt out my dad a little bit, my dad felt out him, it was uncovered that he was actually there because they suspected Ted Kaczynski, our neighbor, of being the Unabomber. And my dad was, shocked doesn't even really cover it. Here's this person that he has lived next door to for, over 17 years himself at this point. And again, he's just in his mind going over dinners together. And I'm sure, that the times that Ted is losing his temper with him and just all of the memories are flooding. And there was also a part of him that was like, no way. There is no way that he could have pulled it. Like, have you met this guy? There's no chance that this hermit has tricked and deceived a nation for 17 years. It's the longest, most expensive FBI investigation in history. There's no way that my neighbor is at fault here. But okay, let's make sure, right?
Yeah, right. You're saying he is, then. Should probably look at it.
So they continue their relationship, and Max is asking him to do certain things, like, we can't really get back there. We would love to see get a glimpse of the property. So my dad does take him back there. Ted Kaczynski comes out of the cabin as they're back there with the FBI agent and my father. But it's my dad. So my dad is a staple in the environment. Ted is not thinking that anything's off. The FBI agents they're very methodical as well. They're dressed as, they've got their Western snap shirts on. They've got boots. They've went as far as renting a rent-a-dent truck. They are completely blending in with their environment. So Ted comes out. My dad kind of waves at him. It's like, it's just Butch here. No worries. And Ted kind of just looks at him, rolls his eyes, goes back into the cabin. And that was the first look that the FBI got at Ted Kaczynski. And Max Knoll was shocked that this was the person that
it's
they
been eluding
had
them
been, hunting and deceiving. Oh, it was definitely a moment for him. So anyways, the investigation continues. They are trying to get images of the cabin, the surrounding. They need it for a search warrant, but they also just need it to prepare for the arrest. They need to know the pitch of the mountain and where Ted could possibly run to if he escapes. And they bring in all of this multi-million-dollar equipment to get the footage. Nothing works because the timber is so dense and there's snow on the ground and Ted's not coming out of the cabin. There's all of these obstacles against him. So the FBI asked my dad to take his little camcorder and walk the roads, record the footage of all of the property, the road that leads up to Ted's house and his cabin. And of course, at this time, my dad knows who potentially his neighbor is. He knows that he has guns because he hunts. He knows that it's very possible that he has bombs in there. But he felt a responsibility. And he knew that he couldn't take one other person getting maimed or killed by the hands of this man. So he did it.
And a fun little factoid, your dad taped on the same footage that you had your Christmas footage. Yeah, so it's like family Christmas.
My dad is he's very resourceful.
Yeah.
And I just had to laugh because I requested the footage from the FBI. It was in the FBI files. And so I wrote in to get those videos, and it comes back to me finally after, and it's always so, anytime still I get an email from the FBI or mail from the FBI, you don't know until you're like in it, but it's a little alarming.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Like, what is this? Yeah. So I open it up and they had converted, it was old school, like cassettes, from camcorder, converted it onto DVDs. So I pop it on my computer and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is our family Christmas. And then it cuts out and there's like static, cuts out to my dad filming the property. And I'm just like, could you not have used a new tape? Like,
yeah. Sounds like the start of a found footage horror movie, Yeah, that's wild. That's a fun little factoid, though.
Plus, what are we missing on that Christmas? Like,
yeah.
What did I get? I'll never know. I don't remember.
Oh, no. Did the FBI give your dad any assurances like around safety protection? Like, was there a sniper out there protecting him as he walked around? Or they're like, all right, you'll be fine.
Good luck.
Bulletproof vest? Nah, you don't need that.
No.
You fight bears out here.
Yeah, I think it was basically like my dad got to choose when it was, and he went out there, he parked his truck at the sawmill, got out at the sawmill, and then just started walking up the road up to Ted's house. And and he couldn't tell anybody either. That was the other thing, because the FBI was very adamant about do not even share this with your wife.
Oh, wow.
Nobody can know what we're doing here. And so he kisses his wife goodbye and heads out the door. She has no idea what he's about to do.
Man,
that's heroic, man.
I know too many people who would be big mouthed about that and start telling people.
Guess what the FBI has had me do?
Yeah. My next door neighbor, it's the biggest case the FBI has had in forever. And yeah, that's wild that your dad, I mean, this goes to show his character, though.
Yeah.
He was willing to keep that a secret, and he was willing to have that bravery to just go in there and do it. He
was so humble about the whole thing. And it was one of the driving forces while I was writing, because he did pass away of cancer. And so while I'm writing the book, of course, he's top of mind in his memory. And I am learning for the first time so many things that my dad helped with and did from the FBI. He never shared those things with us. And, he was told to keep it very hush because it was such a high profile case. He only did a couple interviews, but to not share the details with your own family, that's next level.
Yeah. Wow.
That's FBI for you.
Yeah.
Sounds FBI. As many of you guys know, I have a lot of pets at home, including 3 kitties that I absolutely love. They've been with me for many years now. And one of the things that I'm especially in tune with is their health and making sure that my cats are getting the best possible food out there. And for many years, I was feeding them the highly processed canned food, and now I'm dealing with some of the repercussions of that. A lot of that canned food has tons of preservatives and fillers that are not great for your cat's health. And one of my cats, Tucker, is dealing with intestinal disease right now, and the poor guy is having issues keeping food down, is having diarrhea, and it's just not fun for the poor guy. So Smalls has really been a game changer for all my cats' diets, because they are giving them high quality, high protein packed food that isn't dry kibble. It's got all of the nutrients that they need, and they absolutely love it. What I love about Smalls is that they make it very easy to set up an account with them. There's a little quiz that you go through, you give them their names, and they determine how much food you're going to need to replace what they're currently eating on a day-to-day basis. And all of their protein pack recipes are without preservatives, and it just lives right in your fridge. It's delivered right to your door, so you never have to go out to the store to buy more. It just shows up when you run out. And also, veterinarian.org rates Smalls 10 out of 10 for ingredient quality, so you're getting the best quality food for your cats. And I love Smalls' origin story. You're truly supporting a small business. They started back in 2017 by a couple of guys home cooking cat food in small batches for their friends, and a few short years later, they've served millions of meals to cats across the U.S. After making the switch to Smalls, 90% of cat owners reported overall health improvements, and that's a big deal. I know my cat's health has gotten better. It's food that my cat, Tucker, can actually keep down. I've even talked to my vet about this brand, and my vet approves of it as well. The team at Smalls is so confident your cat will love their product that you can try it risk-free. That means that they'll refund you if your cat won't eat their food, which is always a possibility. Cats are very picky creatures, and you just never know what they're going to like, what they're not going to like. But I have a good feeling that your cat's going to love Smalls if they haven't tried it yet. So now's the time to make the switch to Smalls. Head to smalls.com/lightsout and use promo code lightsout at checkout for 50% off your first order plus free shipping. That's the best offer you'll find, but you have to use our code. Head to smalls.com/lightsout and use promo code lightsout at checkout for 50% off your first order plus free shipping today. So take us through your guys' experience when they swoop in and get Ted. Crazy day, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's the whole day is full of tension. As you know, when I'm interviewing FBI agent Max Knoll, he said, like, you could just feel the tension in the air. Everybody was so just ready to get this done, ready to get it over with. And so it's FBI agent Max Knoll, Tom McDaniel, another FBI agent, and then Officer Jerry Burns, who worked for the Forest Service. And they have their coffee on my father's logging deck. And, you know, my dad's like passing around his little Stanley, filling everybody up. Then they start up they call it the skid road up towards Ted's cabin. And their plan is to get Ted out of the cabin by letting him know that they need him to show him where his property lines are. And it was actually an idea that my dad had, because my dad knew how protective he was over his property and his property lines. And now we know for good reason.
Yeah.
But he thought that would probably get him out of the cabin. So they knock on the door. Ted answers. They introduce themselves. Jerry, the Forest Service agent, was already known to Ted because he worked in the area. So that was not alarming. But he told Ted that he was with these other miners, and they're from this mining company. They needed to see where the property lines were. And he was like, they're clearly marked.
Yeah.
And
you don't think I've done that?
Yeah, exactly.
I would build a wall around it.
If I could. I would cement myself in. So then their response is, well, they're covered in snow. Like, we really do need your assistance. So he's like, okay, let me get my coat. He starts to walk back into the cabin to get his coat, and the Forest Service officer grabs him and pulls him out of the cabin and takes him to the ground. Then the FBI pulls their guns and tells them who they are and what they're here for. So it's wild because who knows, again, if that incident had taken a different direction in any way. Ted had guns very close. He had a bomb right under his bed. So maybe he was going to get a coat, or maybe he felt that he was being threatened. So it's hard to say what was actually going to transpire, but he was apprehended.
And you had a little factoid. He wasn't actually arrested right outside his cabin, right? He was taken to another cabin?
Exactly. So they didn't have enough to arrest him and take him in.
So they were doing it by the book.
Yes. Oh, yes. Everything was very much by the book. So they served him basically with a search warrant. And while the FBI and the bomb task force searched the cabin, they took him to a nearby cabin, like a little hunting cabin. And the FBI had spoken to that person who owned it prior to this day, of course. And they had all sorts of Unabomber timelines, newspaper clippings, different wanted posters all over this cabin. So as soon as Ted walks in there, he realizes
We know who you are. That's what they're saying.
The gravity
right?
of this situation and everything they had already gathered. Obviously, very intentional. And once the FBI starts to go through Ted's cabin, they found they found explosive materials. They found the typewriter that was in question. They knew it was a Smith Corona. And I think it was like 2.5 pica or something like that on the keys. And so they knew exactly what they were looking for. They found those things. And then they knew that they had enough to actually place him under arrest.
Wow, man, what a big day. You know what I love about this story? It's a small little fact, but I love that you brought up, even the most, dedicated FBI agent who is about to go apprehend Ted Kaczynski himself. They start the day just like I do, with just a good cup of coffee. I love that your dad was serving the FBI. They're just hanging out on the porch for a little bit before they were about to go catch the biggest domestic terrorists
I
ever.
know. And there's all these FBI agents like in their white ghillie suits getting all suited up out there, and they're just sipping their coffee.
Because they were prepared for a shootout possibly.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, luckily the plan worked out in their favor. Because had Ted gone in there and like detonated one of his bombs, or
you imagine like him, he might have had like a kill switch.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't have, all the thoughts that would have gone through my head of the danger of going up to that cabin. And it's fascinating that they were able to apprehend him with basically no incident.
It is. And that was very important to David when he was talking to the FBI, and something that FBI agent Max Knoll could not guarantee to the family, obviously, that it would be a safe capture, but they were going to do all that they could to ensure that it was as safe as possible. And they didn't want a Waco or Ruby Ridge type of situation. Yeah. It was very thought out.
Yeah, I think that was the move.
Yeah.
And luckily, you're dealing with a tiny little shack.
Right.
Versus like a compound.
True,
yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
Not busting
Different
into
story.
a compound, so a little bit easier. And he's alone.
Yeah.
He is alone, and the profile is a person, but there's so many writings that are we, us,
True.
our.
Oh, so they thought there was maybe someone else?
I don't know if, again, the profile was a person, but you couldn't completely rule out that there weren't others involved. So there was, there were a lot of unknowns, and they also knew that Ted most likely had some other cabins set up in order to escape with weapons and dried food and things like that if he needed to escape. So if he was able to get out of that cabin and they lost him, who knows where he could have been.
Right.
And so that was also a fear of the FBI's if they didn't get him in, a safe, secure place where they could remove him.
And that's why they brought so many of them too.
Yes.
And didn't they had SWAT teams or something out on the road?
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
From your research, why do you think it took the FBI so long to solve this?
I think it was a lot of different reasons. I think that the case was investigated by different units, and in transition, there were things that were lost until it finally ended up, with the FBI and a dedicated team. So there's that portion of it. There's also the fact that Ted is using these untraceable items in his bombs. He's not going to the hardware store or buying his chemicals off of Amazon. He is sourcing and finding these elements of his bombs in a way that they are completely untraceable. And so that definitely added to the difficulty in finding this person and hunting him down.
And you had, after his arrest, this was many years later, obviously, but you did have an interaction with Ted when he was in prison, correct?
Yes, I decided that I'd always wanted to write to Ted and it was more about me than it was about him. It was just basically like, I'm pretty pissed off that what you've done and what you did to our family. And that's really kind of what motivated it initially. And then obviously for writing my book, it was so important to me to tell the entire story in this. So it's easy enough for me to like exist in a vacuum and just tell my story. But it wasn't the whole story. It was so much more important to tell the story of this whole person, even though he was this bad guy in my mind. He was still a child. He was still an adolescent. He still had these experiences. He had a family. And so I felt the need to incorporate as many things as possible to give my reader a full look at all of these people involved, even Ted. And so that was part of that process, was writing to him and getting his thoughts into the book as well.
Did they ever let people visit with him?
Yes, actually. And I had just started the process of visiting him because he was in Supermax in Florence, Colorado, and there were very specific criteria to visiting an inmate there. You had to know him previously prior to incarceration, be a family member, or law enforcement, and I think maybe some journalists, obviously, because there was that one interview that came out. But it definitely, you had to be like vetted, and it was a process. So I had just started that process, and then the pandemic happened, and they stopped allowing visitors at Supermax. And then once I wrote to him and he wrote back to me, I felt like that was enough. I really didn't need anything additional, like for my own closure.
What did you ask him, and what did he say to you?
So in my letter, I probably wrote like 9 pages to him, and it was personal. It was, some nods to like some different memories growing up, next to him. My father, I wanted to let him know that my father had passed, and while they didn't have a close friendship at the end, there was still, something there from being neighbors for so long. And I thought he would appreciate knowing that. Lots of things like that. And then I did get into just a little bit more on social issues and, what he thought of adolescent development and technology and some different, like, pretty specific things. And so while my letter to him was very thoughtful and very researched and pretty thorough, his response was not quite the same.
You spent a lot more time on yours than he
Yes,
did on
exactly.
yours. Yeah. Do you say anything about your dad passing?
No, which was actually just one more thing. That was like, okay, I don't need to go
Yeah,
see
you're
him
like,
at the
okay,
Supermax.
you don't
He didn't even acknowledge
Oh, wow.
that part in his response.
What a dick.
Yeah. It was
He
kind
just
of a
wants to talk about ideals
power
and-
move.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, no, it was, a nod to like, thanks. It's always good to hear from people who I've known in the past, and thank you for writing. And, talking about there was a page lost, I guess, in the letter. And so he got his digs in on the law enforcement that was working there.
Throwing shade
And
at the
they're incompetent.
Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Yes, exactly.
It's like, of course.
So there's that. And then he literally told me to buy his book on Amazon.com.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Imagine
closing.
writing this very thoughtful letter, thought-provoking, and someone just goes, just go buy my book. God.
It was
There's really nothing likable about Ted Kaczynski.
It wasn't shocking because I did expect that because, like I said, all the conversations that we would have were so much on the surface through the years. And so I didn't really think that he was going to like go deep and offer condolences to my dad. Was there a part of me that maybe hoped
Worth a shot.
that he was experiencing some sort of rehabilitation,
Right.
and those years in prison had maybe changed him a little and his perspective? Of course, there was part of me that hoped for that, but I wasn't, again, like shocked that that was the response.
Seems like prison only helped him like continue in his old ways. Like from what you were saying, he's really thrived in prison. He was really enjoying his life, I guess, being in that sort of confinement. I mean, it's kind of something he conditioned himself throughout his life. But you think he ever changed or felt an ounce of guilt or regret about anything he did?
I don't think so. I think there were moments in his writings where he had some fleeting guilt, but it was fleeting. It wasn't anything that I don't think if he did things differently, he would have changed.
Yeah. I think he was going to continue had he not been caught, just going to continue killing. And, you know, this was an interesting thing that we were talking about in our episode of, you know, we're kind of towards the, you know, his arrest, 96. The internet's starting to really come about. Would Ted have been any different had he had access to the internet and knew how to utilize that as a tool? Would he have continued using that for bad and evil? Or could he have seen that there's a way to connect with people like him, maybe in a more positive way?
That's a really interesting question. I think that at the time of his arrest, because he was so immersed in this life, there was no going back. I think that he would have used the internet to target his victims. And, you know, that is one of the reasons that he made mistakes during his bombing campaign. He was looking through old directories, printed directories for his targets.
Right.
And so by the time he's reading this directory, somebody else had been put in that position as, you know, the president or whoever he was going after. And so he bombed the wrong people. And so I think he just would have used technology. He would have found that loophole in the manifesto to use technology for his own ideology and used it in that way. But
And
that's just my opinion.
the loophole that you're referencing is basically like he was saying, I can use technology as long as it furthers my goals, right?
As long as it's furthering the cause.
The cause, yeah.
100% agree with you. He would have definitely used it as a tool to just
Do terrible things.
do more damage for sure.
One more thing I kind of want to ask. Lincoln, you've returned, right? Since then. Is it still kind of the same sleepy town as it was? Does it have a different connotation now?
Do people go out there to find Ted's cabin?
Yeah, so it went through a very strange time right after the arrest where it was just swarming with journalists, with people who wanted to see where Ted had lived, and it definitely felt different there. But, you know, it's many years later at this point. Ted was arrested in 96. There are still people who come to Lincoln to see what it feels like, what it looks like in this place that this serial killer lived. And there is a couple places in town who I think they have one of the shops, the cannabis shops, has like a Unabomber strain, I think.
Oh my God.
And there is a
Wow.
like a Kaczynski draft
I'm
beer.
sure.
Of course.
I think they have my book
Hey,
as well.
all right.
But, so there is still that part of Lincoln. It has expanded. It's still only about 1,000 residents. It's a very small town. I think the ratio of bars to churches is about the same. But there is a skate park that was donated by Jeff Ament from Pearl Jam in the town, a little community center. There is a beautiful art installation outside of town that's like this walking trail. They bring in all these international artists that do these sculptures that are able to kind of blend in with the natural environment. And there's definitely these bits of culture, and there is a change in this tiny little town. So it's not all about the home of this serial killer. Doesn't mark it forever.
That's good. Yeah.
Hopefully a positive change,
Yes.
you see. So there is something to come of that. I could go there to get my Unabomber IPA on draft.
I can smoke my Unabomber bowl. My God.
And, the Blackfoot River runs right through that town. And so there's the movie A River Runs Through It
Yeah.
that, is...
The fly fishing movie, right? Yeah, I love that movie.
And it's a beautiful movie, and it's a beautiful river. And so that attracts a lot of outdoorsmen, a lot of peaceful fishermen. So there's all these different elements to the town that are much more positive.
That's good.
Is there anything, before we kind of wrap things up, and we obviously want to talk about your book and where to find it and all that good stuff, is there anything throughout this whole process in writing your book that really shocked you, that you were maybe not ready for, or something you found out about your father that maybe you never knew? Was there anything like that you came across?
I think that the most difficult part of this and the most shocking part of this, through it was 5 years of research and trying to crawl into this serial killer's mind, just the emotional toll of that, trying to understand a murderer, was shocking to me. I didn't realize how difficult that part would be. And in addition to that, it was the research that I unearthed while writing the book. This story has been told in so many different ways for so long, but there were still things that I found that were terrifying to me. I mean, the fact that I found the proof that Ted Kaczynski had poisoned and killed my family pet, the journal entries of him debating killing my stepmother and toddler sister. I mean, those types of things, to me, I wasn't quite ready for. But, it was definitely important to the process. And as I said, I wanted to tell the entire story. And so I had to do the book justice and do exactly that, no matter how difficult that was.
Yeah. And I wanted to bring up too, the victims that did lose their lives in this case, and just how the devastation when that happens is not only immediate, but it's long term, and it affects those families for years and years to come. Did you have any conversations or experience or research along the victims and their experiences?
I did a lot of research on the victims. I read all of the victim impact statements from the trial, which I felt like were the most powerful examples of that raw human emotion and that ripple effect of Ted's violence. So after I read those, I connected with David Kaczynski and I really didn't feel the need to reach out and speak to the victims specifically. And it was out of respect because I had what I needed to tell this story, and their specific trauma wasn't my story to tell. And I just didn't want, I know that even now, when I talk about our history with Ted, there is an effect on you. And I didn't want to invite that into their lives. So
yeah, I think that makes sense and is a thoughtful thing to do. That's their story to tell if they want to.
Exactly.
Tell it. One more question for me, and then I promise I'm done. My voice is begging me to shut up right now. But of course, all of us want to know: did Ted Kaczynski know that you wrote this book?
Ted Kaczynski did know that I wrote this book. And I actually told him that I was writing a book about my childhood, our experiences, and as much of his story as I could. And I wrote that letter to him in prison. I did not get a response after that. So it's hard to say. I don't know if he read it or not. But I guess I'll never know, honestly, if Ted Kaczynski did read my book. But hopefully, if he did, he bought it.
Yeah. I was going to say
Amazon.com.
Yeah. And your last correspondence with him was like, you should read my book. And now you're like, well, you should read my book.
Yeah, right.
Well, is there anything else that you wanted to cover before we talk about where people can go and find your book?
I don't think so. I think that was very thorough. I can't think of anything.
I can't either. That was,
it was great.
Clearly I'm at a loss for words here. So I'm going to let Austin wrap this up. But of course, we want you to go check out Jamie's book.
So you can find my book, Madman in the Woods, Life Next Door to the Unabomber. Really anywhere you buy your books. I know that's very vague, but Amazon, Barnes & Noble, you can listen to me narrate it, which I did have to try out for, by the way, on Audible. You can read it on Kindle. You can also support your favorite bookstore, which is what I would vote for. Any local mom and pop bookstore, if they don't have it, they can order it for you.
Nice. And I have listened to the audiobook. It was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, I listened to part of it too, and I was like, wow, you're pro.
Yeah.
It was really hard.
It is hard. It's very hard.
Didn't realize how difficult that would be when I decided that I really wanted to do it. But then once I auditioned for it, I had to wait like 2 weeks before I found out if I got the part. And I was so like angsty about it. I was like, I want this so bad. Yeah. I didn't know I wanted it so bad until it was basically in front of me.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know that. I think people assume you write the book, you get to be the voice of it.
Right, but, yeah, no.
Does that part of your book deal? Was the Audible, or is that just how they work?
It happened after the book deal.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So I signed my regular traditional publishing deal that was out in the world, and then at least for pre-order, and then my book went to auction, which means multiple people were interested in the audio rights, and it was Audible and a few others, and Audible won. So they produced my my audiobook, and like I said, I didn't realize either that the author, just especially with a memoir, wouldn't be able to just narrate their own book. But I get it, I guess, just because you can write the book doesn't mean you can read the book.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they have a financial interest in it at that point, and they want it to be a success. So
they wouldn't want like a Ted Kaczynski voice.
Yeah.
Right.
Or my voice right now.
Yeah, true.
Nobody's hiring me for voiceover right now.
Yeah, so it was definitely a learning experience, but it was super fun actually to narrate my own book.
Read what David Kaczynski said about your book, because I liked his quote on it.
This is David Kaczynski. He said, quote, Jamie Gehring's book might well be the best attempt yet to understand the strange life and mind of my brother, Theodore J. Kaczynski. Big words right there.
Yeah, and honestly, as an author, there's a process that I had to learn about, and that is sending out your advanced reader copies to various people in the industry, your connections, that would provide a strong blurb for the book. And so before the book is out in the world, I have to, with my publisher's assistance, find these people. David was a connection, but I was so scared to send him my final manuscript because it was his, I guess, blessing to me, because we had become so close, was so incredibly important to me. So those weeks while he's reading and I'm waiting, I was just on pins and needles, just so nervous.
Please like it, please like it.
And he said his words were something like, he gave me that blurb, and then he said, not that you need my blessing, but you have my blessing.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
That's good. Well, there you have it.
Yeah.
Do you want me to talk us out?
That would be great. I think I'm literally gone.
Well, for the first time ever, I'm going to get to talk us out on a Lights Out episode. Jamie, thank you so much for being here.
Such a treat.
This was great. This is my first experience with a guest, and I had a blast listening to you. It's very insightful. So thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I hope the studio didn't creep you out too much.
No.
Okay, good.
We'll do a blessing before you leave. Make sure we cleanse you here.
But yeah, that's it for this episode. If you liked it, go comment, go subscribe, do all that good stuff.
And we'll put all of Jamie's links below here in the description box, or if you're listening, in the show description for you. Go support her book. There is I looked on Amazon this morning, 17 left on Amazon. We can sell that out. Let's sell that out.
Let's do it.
Get some more restock going. So, but yeah, take us out with the...
Yeah, but until next time, lights out, everybody.
Thank you, guys.